Hi everyone, this is our first practicing Stoicism video. I'm going to be making these short videos each week as we work our way through Epictetus's Handbook. The Greek term for that is enchiridion. So if you look in our little book, How to Be Free, you'll see that the translator has just left it in the Greek as enchiridion. It can be translated as handbook or manual, and it's something that I like to think of as a kind of training manual. It's something that it's short and you can read it and reread it, carry it around with you. And I think the idea is it'll give you little things to think about, exercises, ways to maybe change your habits of mind, how you relate to things in the world, how you feel about things, what you do, how you treat people, what kinds of judgments you make. So there's going to be a lot of things that we'll be thinking about and practicing, and you'll get a chance to do that just as a part of our daily life. We'll just go about things and we'll try to have these things ready at hand. That was one of the things Epictetus wanted us to do. And also you can write about these things in your philosophy journal. Okay, now one of the things I really like about this edition that we're using is there is a wonderful introduction in it. So I recommend that you read that, and it gives you an overview of Stoicism. It talks about some of the key ideas. There's also a great glossary in the back where the first time that he uses a word, he puts an asterisk next to it, and then you can look in the back and see how he's defined it. So there's some handy things there. He talks a little bit about the translation. He talks about the history of the enchiridion, the handbook. And also one thing that's kind of neat about our translation is we have the Greek as well as the English, right? So even if you don't read Greek, it's kind of neat to see it. That was the language that Epictetus spoke. That was the language that the handbook was written in. So you can look at it, maybe it'll inspire you to want to study some Greek. I don't know a lot of Greek. I did 3 semesters worth when I was a graduate student, and it was fun. And it was hard work, but it was neat to translate and think through some of these things. So that's there for you to look at. Occasionally I'll talk about certain Greek terms. Now, in this video may be a little bit longer than the typical one. I want to just say a few things about Epictetus, just give you a little bit of background. And some of these things you can get from the introduction, of course. The first thing to know about him maybe is that he was a former slave. He was somebody who had been enslaved and then was freed. So he was sometimes referred to as a freedman, someone who once was a slave and is now free. And his name, actually, Epictetus, literally just means acquired. So we don't think that maybe was his actual name. We don't know what it was. Scholars assume that Epictetus is associated with the fact that he was called Epictetus because he formerly was a slave. He was born about 55 AD and died about 135 AD. So living 1st, 2nd century. And he was somebody who was both a student of Stoic philosophy as well as a teacher, first in Rome, and then at a certain point, the emperor of the time banned all philosophers from Rome and made them leave. And he ended up settling in Nicopolis, Greece, and founding his own school. And that's where he served as a philosophy teacher for many years, and people would go and they would study with him. And another thing that's interesting about Epictetus is, as far as we know, he didn't actually write anything himself. So the 2 works that are normally attributed to Epictetus, we think were actually written down by a student of his whose name is Arrian, who was a famous general and historian in his own right. There's other works we have by him that have survived. And apparently, though, the style is very different from what we have in the 2 works that are associated with Epictetus. The first one, the main work, is called the Discourses. And we have what are called 4 books or chapters of the discourses, and we think there were 8, so half of the discourses didn't survive. We don't have them anymore. There are fragments, and sometimes people later will write about these things, and they will quote a passage from something, and we know it's from a part of the discourses that we don't have. So we know there was more, and it's sad, but at least we have those 4 books. And then we have the handbook, which is kind of a compressed version of the discourses. Some of the remarks are from the discourses or some of the same thoughts, but they've been sort of distilled down to serve as something that a student could carry with them, could practice with, could reflect on, and sort of try to almost digest what's in them so that you have these thoughts and words ready at hand as you face certain challenges in life. Okay, so we're going to be reading the handbook, and hopefully more than once, many times. In fact, you'll see for this first week, initially I just say read the whole thing, which might sound like a lot, but it's not that many pages. It's maybe 50, I'm not sure. In our edition, it starts on page 3 and it finishes on page 95, but remember every other page is Greek. So, and it's, look at the, I mean, there's a lot of space and a lot of room, and you'll see my edition, I've got all sorts of writing in it. So I'm hoping you can quickly read through the whole thing just to kind of get a sense of what's there. And then each week we're going to just look at a handful of remarks and just kind of read them and reread them and think about them. And as you make your way through, I'm hoping you'll be sort of cycling back and reading and rereading, because some of the things that you're reading initially, they just won't make any sense. And the only way that they will is if you kind of continue to reflect on them and think about them. And as we read another book we're going to read in this class, The Practicing Stoic by Farnsworth, there are all sorts of excerpts from that, and we're going to be learning a lot about Stoicism more generally, and you'll see some of the excerpts are from the handbook and some are from the discourses. So Epictetus will figure a lot in our discussion of Stoicism. And so often I'll just treat this as if, you know, these are Epictetus's words, but we know that they were written by Arrian, so maybe he made a few changes, or but he clearly wants to create as best he can what it was like to hear Epictetus talk. His voice, his sense of humor. Sometimes he can be sort of stern. Sometimes he will refer to the reader as a slave. And he doesn't mean like a literal slave, somebody who's physically owned by someone else. He means sort of like a mental slave, somebody who is not thinking well, or who has a bad habits of mind, and he'll kind of be a little gruff sometimes. So that you might find a little strange. You kind of have to get to know him and the way that he talks and the way that he thinks, what he finds funny. So we'll be doing that. All right, so what are some other things to tell you about him? We'll see as we're reading the handbook, and this is true of Stoicism more generally, but this comes up in the handbook in particular, that there are 3 main topics. I mean, the handbook as a whole concerns, you could say, ethics very broadly. And there are 3 topics that come up in sometimes in stretches, but they're all three of them are important. The first one is called the discipline of desire. So what does that mean? It means you're working on managing, controlling, shaping your desires and your aversions. What are they? The things that you strongly want and the things that you strongly don't want, right? You have a strong desire for things, or you have a strong desire for other things not to happen. Those are the things you're averse to. And the discipline of desire is you finding ways to shape those things, to manage them, to make it so that your desires and your aversions are things that you have some control over. Partly because what the Stoics believe is a lot of our unhappiness comes naturally from cases where our desires don't come true and where our aversions do, right? The things that you want to happen don't happen. The things that you really don't want to happen do. And in those cases, frequently then what results is all sorts of strong emotional reactions by us, right? Things like anger or fear or disappointment, or maybe envy or frustration. These are things that are going to be disruptive to you leading a certain kind of life. And so the Stoics believe that if you engage in a kind of this discipline of desire, then that will help you to limit the disruptive emotional results that sometimes come about when our desires aren't met or when our aversions are. Okay. So this first discipline, you might say, has something to do with primarily with feeling and emotion, right? It has to do with the things we want and the things we don't want. The second discipline is called the discipline of action. And that has to do more with doing than with wanting or not wanting, right? The choices we make, the way that we relate to other people, the way they relate to ourselves, right? The sorts of things. And here's a case where obviously you may try to do something and it doesn't work out, right? The Stoics are aware of that. They're aware that many of the actions that we try to perform, the outcome isn't something that we can maybe fully control. But what we can focus on is what sorts of things do we try to do? What sorts of things do we try not to do? So the impulses to act a certain way rather than not, or the impulses not to do certain things. So that's a second broad topic that they focus on, you might say. If you can discipline your actions, then you're going to discipline the sorts of things you do or try to do, at least in your life. Okay, and then the third discipline is called the discipline of assent. What does assent mean? It means to agree, right? To approve, to go along with. And this is a case where the Stoics associate this partly with how we reason, the judgments we make, and really what they're talking about in particular are cases where how things strike you in the world. Like you have certain impressions of things. You have certain impressions that this is how things are, right? These are what the facts are, or you have certain impressions that certain things are good or certain things are bad. And where assent comes in is kind of like, do you agree with how things appear to you, right? If it looks like these are the facts, do you say, yeah, these are the facts? Do you sort of put your personal stamp on that? Or if something appears to you to be really bad, do you then say, yeah, that actually is really bad? Do you sort of like personally endorse it? Okay, so the discipline of assent is going to be also about trying to get you to be more cautious or more reflective or more careful about what you go along with, right? Just because the world strikes you a certain way doesn't mean that it is. And the Stoics think that sometimes we get into trouble when we just go along with the way the world appears too quickly, right? So learning to do things more reflectively, more carefully, that's a part of the discipline of assent. So we've got three disciplines, right? The discipline of desire and aversion, but it's normally just called the discipline of desire, the discipline of action, and the discipline of assent. And we'll notice as we're reading through the handbook that there are different topics that seem to be primarily about one of those three, but they're all related, right? The person that the Stoic thinks of as the ideal, like the wise person, the one who knows how to live, the sage, is somebody who's going to have mastered all three of these disciplines. Somebody who has mastered their desires and their aversions, their impulses to act, and what they do and do not assent to. Okay, now the other thing I wanted to say just sort of generally about Stoicism, and we're going to come back to this later in the course, is broadly, and this is not just limited to Stoicism, many of the ancient Greek and Roman philosophies would divide things topically into three broad topics: ethics, physics, and logic. Those are the three big topics. Physics concerns the nature of the world, what there is at all, what the basic things are. Sometimes we talk about metaphysical questions that would fall broadly under the topic of physics. Ethics, which we're going to be focusing on this course, of course, concerns what ought to happen, what we ought to do, how we ought to relate, how we ought to feel. And then logic is about correct reasoning, correct judgment. So we can sort of see how, in some ways, these broad topics, even though our topic is ethics, sometimes when we're reflecting on one of these disciplines, whether it's assent or desire or action, what will come to the front is a question that might look like it's more to do with physics, say, rather than ethics or logic. Physics-like questions are going to concern asking yourself, what is the nature of something, or what are the causes that lead to that thing? And sometimes it's going to be helpful for you to remind yourself of what these things are as you're sort of preparing to go out into the world for the day. And we'll see that that's one of the kinds of things that the Stoics will encourage us to do, and Epictetus in particular, to prepare for our day, right? We'll look at the day and we'll remind ourselves, hey, I'm going to, like, maybe you're going to renew your driver's license. And you might ask yourself, all right, what's that going to be like? I mean, what is it like when you go to somewhere where you renew your driver's license? Well, oftentimes there are long lines, and people can be rude and push you, and they might try to cut in line, right? That you've been waiting a long time, and then somebody like cuts in front of you, or maybe just as you get up to the window where it's your turn, it's that person, the person who works there, it's time for a break. So then you have to wait even longer, and you're going to get frustrated. That sort of thing, we'll see, is the kind of thing that occasionally Epictetus will ask us to reflect on and remind ourselves on, about, partly to sort of prepare for what we may encounter that day. Okay, so after you kind of read through the whole of the handbook, which I hope you'll do, and you'll notice at the end of the book I've ordered, the How to Be Free, there are some selections from the discourses as well. So you can get a sampling of what the discourses are like by reading some of those. We're going to be focusing on the handbook in this course. And like I said, once you read the whole thing, then for this week, we're just looking at the first two remarks. And I just want to draw your attention to a few things while you're looking at that. The very first thing, right? So let's just look at this. Section 1. What does Epictetus first say? He says, some things in the world are up to us, while others are not. Okay, this is sometimes called the dichotomy of control. What things are in your control and what things are not in your control. What things are in your power and what things are not. And the Stoics sort of want initially to just kind of draw a sharp distinction between things that are in your control or up to you and things that aren't. And by that they mean fully, right? So there may be some things that you can influence or have some control over, but you can't, it's not totally up to you what the outcome is, okay? And Epictetus gives us some examples, right? He says, things that are up to us are, and he gives us a bunch, right? Judgment, motivation, desire, and aversion. Everything, he says, that is our own doing, okay? So things that we do, things that are up to us, our freedom, our choice, our moral character, they arise from us. Those are the things that he thinks are fully in our power. Whereas there are other things that are not up to us, he says. And some of them you might be surprised by what he claims are not up to us. He says, our body, our property, our reputations, our official positions, everything that's not our own doing. Okay, so we have things that are our own doing and things that aren't. And you might think to yourself, well, my body, don't I have control over my body? And of course you do, right? I'm scratching my head right now. I'm moving my arm, or I'm pointing. These are things that I can do. So he's not it's not that Epictetus is unaware of that, of course. He's trying to draw attention to the fact that there are ways that you don't have full control over that. So if somebody were to put handcuffs on me and I had an itch, I wouldn't be able to lift my arm and scratch my head, right? Or if I was in a car accident and my leg was broken and I tried to lift it, maybe it wouldn't work because the bone is broken or something like that. So these are the sorts of things that are not fully in our control. I mean, your reputation. Obviously, we like to think that our reputation is at least partly influenced by what we actually do and say, right? But people sometimes are misled, or they form false opinions about you, or maybe there are people who don't like you and they spread rumors about you and lies. That you can't really control. I mean, you can try to tell people, hey, that's not true. And maybe they'll believe you, maybe they won't. But there's a sense in which, like, ultimately, these things are not fully up to you. Okay, so that's Epictetus wants us to focus on what are the things that are up to us and those that are not. Okay, and getting clear about that, it may take some practice. You may have to sort of ask yourself about different things in your life. Hey, is this up to me or not? Okay, and that's a kind of a question you can start just trying to ask yourself. Now, he associates the things that are up to us with what he calls are things that are free. Whereas he says things that are not up to us are powerless or servile or impeded. They're not our own. So there's a sense in which, like, things that are up to us, he wants to say, are the things that we control, we have power over. In a way, they're the only things that really and truly belong to us, he thinks. Whereas the things that are not fully up to us don't belong to us. So that means Epictetus thinks our bodies, in a weird way, don't belong to us fully. I mean, because we don't have complete control over them, right? Or our reputations, they don't belong to us. So that's a strange idea. And that's just something we're going to try to think about and get used to. Now, as he's talking about these things, he says, he sort of sketches a couple of lives. He sort of says, you know what, a lot of people are unhappy because they confuse these things. What does he mean by that? He says, if you think things that are naturally servile are free, and things that are not our own are our own, that they are ours, you will be frustrated, pained, and troubled, and you will find fault with gods and men, with human beings. So one way to understand what Epictetus and the Stoics more generally are trying to do is get us to be aware of what are the things that actually belong to us and what are the things that don't, and try to help us not confuse them. They think a lot of why we are frustrated, unhappy, miserable, what have you, is because we run these things together, we mix them up, we want things that are not up to us, they're not in our control. So people who are frustrated, pained, troubled, and find fault with gods and other people. On the other hand, and that's most of us, right? I mean, that's our life. He's describing what life is like for most of us. And then the Stoics are going to describe an alternative. What if you could have a different kind of life? A life where you think you own only what is yours and you don't own what is not yours, right? He says, if you could get to that point, like if your mind was clear about what is yours and what isn't, what is up to you and what is not, then he says, no one will ever put pressure on you. That sounds interesting. No one will impede you. No one will stand in your way at all. Hard to believe, but that's what he's saying, right? You will not reproach anyone. You won't criticize anyone. You won't blame anyone. And you won't do anything reluctantly. Everything you do will be because you want to do it. Nobody will harm you. You won't have any enemies. And nothing harmful will ever happen to you. That sounds pretty good, right? But it sounds impossible. Because you might think, well, he just said that my body's not up to me, And clearly somebody could like take a knife and come up and cut my arm. Haven't I been harmed? Now, we're not going to get clear about this for a while, but interestingly, the Stoics, and we'll see also Socrates, who is sort of the grandfather of Stoicism. He didn't found Stoicism, but he sort of inspired it. He also doesn't think that that actually, properly speaking, should be considered a harm. It doesn't mean that they want you to be somebody to cut their body. And of course, they would rather have a healthy body than an unhealthy body, or a body that was hurt in some way. But what they want to say is, that's not you. There's a difference between you and your body. So we're going to have to get clear about that. Now, another thing to kind of notice in this section is that Epictetus also notes, all right, there are these couple, there's the unhappy life, you might say, and the happy life. And you might think, yeah, that sounds good. I want to lead the happy life. And then the first thing he sort of says is, well, look, the first thing you need to know is this is not an easy thing. You can't just decide, hey, I'm going to live like a Stoic, no big deal, and then you do. It's going to take hard work on your part and a lot of training and a lot of time. It might unfold over many months or many years. And in fact, most of the Stoics believe that there's almost never been a full sage, somebody who's fully wise. For most of us, the best we can do is become a philosopher, somebody who loves wisdom, who seeks it, who tries to lead a life informed by wisdom. And really, for us, like where we're starting, is even calling ourselves philosophers is kind of presumptuous. Like, it's more like we're philosophy students, right? We're trying to become philosophers. And maybe after many years, we could sort of say, yeah, I guess I'm a philosopher, but it's not something I want to brag about. I'm certainly not a sage. Okay, so we're kind of moving toward the life of the sage, but the sage is sort of a distant ideal. And maybe, for most of us, we're never going to get there, but we can make progress. That's the hope anyway. So what does he say? He says, look, you're going to have to be highly motivated if you want this better life, right? If you want to achieve such great goals, you're going to have to, he says, forego some things completely, give them up, right? You can't just have everything that you have presently in your life. If you want this better life, you're going to have to make some sacrifices, he says, right? You're also going to have to put some things off, postpone them. So you may get them eventually, but you can't have them now, right? It'll interfere with your training, is maybe one way to put it. And then he warns us, he says, look, if you want both, if you want things that are really yours, plus you want other things like prominence and wealth, maybe, he says, that's probably a recipe for failure across the board, right? He says, you might not even get to be rich. Like if you want to be rich and you also want to be happy, you might get neither. But he says you definitely won't get the freedom and happiness that you can only get through trying to lead this Stoic life. Okay, so that's the warning. It's going to be hard work, and you're going to have to give some things up. And we'll see later in the handbook that he notes, like, other people are going to find how you're living maybe a little strange, and they might be critical, or they might feel threatened. They might not understand what you're up to, or why you maybe no longer value some of the things that they value. And so he kind of warns us about that as well. We'll get to that later. Okay, but so let's see then. One last thing. Where does he leave us at the end of this first section? He says, he kind of gives us like some homework, right? He says, make it your habit to tell every jarring thought or impression something, right? So remember, what's a jarring thought or impression? Like you have, something occurs to you, or something strikes you, it looks a certain way. And notice he's not just talking about any old impression, he's talking about ones that are jarring, like ones that kind of unsettle you in some way, right? When that happens, you want to try to get in the frame of mind of noticing that it's happening. And then what does he say? He says, almost like you're supposed to talk to this thing that you see, right? Or this, something feels a certain way. You don't just immediately accept it, you kind of talk to it. And what do you say? He says, you are just an appearance, you're supposed to say, and in no way the real thing. Okay, so what does that mean? You're drawing a distinction between how something appears to you and what that thing actually is. And you're just saying, look, just because this looks a certain way to me doesn't mean that it is. And you need to just learn to do that. And it's hard because we're all in the habit of just like taking things at face value, right? Taking things at face value without maybe stopping and pausing in that way, right? So he says, when you do that, then what you should do is examine those impressions and test them. And there's certain rules that you should use. And the main one, he says, is ask yourself about these impressions. Is whatever it is I see, is it up to me or is it not up to me? And he says, if the impression involves things that are not up to us, then you should have a certain response ready, kind of in your mind. And what is that response? He says, not my business. So there's certainly in which he's like, wants us to train our minds to sort of start thinking about what is and is not up to us. And I know this doesn't really make sense, but this is kind of, he's setting us a homework assignment, but we don't quite know what exactly we're supposed to do. But that's what he wants us to be doing, going around whenever you have an impression and a jarring impression, to sort of stop and go, hey, I don't know, let's think of an example. Maybe somebody comes and tells you somebody was in a car accident. And that's kind of upsetting or disturbing, right? And you sort of, the first thing you should do, instead of just getting upset, is just ask yourself, hey, the impression I just received is that somebody was in a car accident. Is that up to, is what this is about, is it up to me or not up to me? It's not up to me. So my basic outlook should be not my business or something like that. And so what does that mean? We're going to have to figure that out. Okay. Okay. Second section. We're going to look at 2 remarks today. So now we're moving on to the second section. And here he is honing in on this discipline of desire. He's going to talk about desires and aversions. And in particular, he's going to talk about aversions for several remarks. We'll see. So he's going to say, hey, let's focus on things that you really don't want to happen. But let's look at how he does it. He says, look, what does he mean by desire? He doesn't just mean, you lightly want something. He kind of means like you strongly want this thing, right? And you think that if you don't get it, your life is going to go badly, right? So it's like, I really want this. Maybe it's you really want to win the race, or you really want to get an A in a class, or you really want this person to love you, what have you, right? Or you really don't want something, right? And what he says is, when you have a strong desire, it's sort of built into that desire that you're going to get what you want, right? Or when you have a strong aversion, he says it presumes that you're going to avoid what you don't want. Like that's like your mental outlook, right? And if you don't get what you want, or you do get what you don't want, he says, that's when life goes poorly, right? That's when he says, if we don't get what we want, we're unfortunate. Or if we get what we don't want, we're miserable, right? So in both cases, like life doesn't go the way we hope it will, right? Our life, it seems like we're leading a poor life because our desires and our aversions are not going the way we want them to, right? So what's the solution? Epictetus says we need to restrict our aversions. He says restrict aversion only to those things that are up to you. Like if of all the things that you don't want to happen, you could limit it to only things that are up to you, well then you would have control over whether or not those bad things happened or not, right? If it was just up to you, as long as you then follow through, then nothing that you're averse to would ever happen, right? Or if something that you're averse to did happen, it would be your fault. You wouldn't have to blame anybody else, right? So that's what he says, like when it comes to aversion, let's restrict it. Let's transfer it. Let's limit it to things that are up to us. But there are lots of things that we're averse to that are not up to us. And he gives some primary examples like sickness, death, poverty, right? Those are things we don't want, we very strongly. And the Stoics say, stop that. Stop having a strong feeling about avoiding sickness, death, and poverty. And you might just think, that's crazy. I'm not going to stop wanting those things not to happen to me. Of course I don't want to die. Of course I don't want to be poor. Of course I don't want to be sick. And so we're going to have to think about like what they mean, because as we'll see, the Stoics aren't crazy. Like they don't say you can't have any preferences at all. Of course they would prefer to be healthy rather than unhealthy. They would prefer to have money rather than to be poor. They'd prefer to be alive rather than dead, right? So when they say like don't be averse to those things, they're sort of saying something special. So we're gonna have to figure out what that means. And then he says, interestingly about desire, he says, as for desire, just give it up completely for the time being. What does that mean? It means don't really strongly want anything for a while anyway. Like think of it as you're in training, you're in a sort of special frame of mind. And so anything that you really want, you're supposed to sort of bracket or set aside. You're kind of trying to practice not really wanting anything. It's kind of weird. But that's what he says. So he says, limit the things that you're averse to things that are only up to you. And as far as desire goes, just don't really desire anything. That's what we're supposed. And again, like you can see, like that's not something you could do immediately. Like you could just say, all right, I'm not going to desire anything, and then your life has fully changed. No, I mean, it's going to take practice. It's going to take effort on your part. You're going to notice yourself, and you're going to have to sort of talk to yourself and say, oh, God, I still really want that. I need to sort of try to set that aside, whatever that means, mentally, change my, outlook in some sense, right? But notice he says this for the time being. So he's not saying you'll never be able to desire things, right? He said, because what he does say, he says, if you desire things that are not up to us, then of course you're opening yourself up to unfortunate things happening to you, right? To your life being unfortunate. But what he also says is things that are up to us that you could properly desire, they're not really available to you right now. Why is that? Well, maybe because we're still sort of early on in our Stoic training. If we got further along at a certain point, maybe some desire can enter back in. But what he's saying right now is initially, you should just try not to desire anything and try to limit what you're averse to. That's like, think of it as like a second homework assignment, right? Remember in the first remark, he said, we need to try to, how we relate to our impressions, how we manage our impressions, how we talk to them, how we think about them. We need to try to change that. And here he's sort of saying, think about what you desire and what you're averse to, right? And instead, he kind of leaves us, he says, like, basically, we're trying to manage our emotional outlook in some ways, right? And he says, confine yourself to motivation and disinclination. What does that mean? Motivation are things you want to do. Disinclination are things you don't want to do. But notice, like now, we're not, instead of talking about how we feel, right? Whether I desire something or whether I'm averse to something, we're talking about our impulses to act, right? If you're motivated, you have an impulse to do something. If you're disinclined, you have an impulse not to do something. And he sort of says, focus on that. Sort of try to think of yourself as somebody who who's capable of making choices, who can do things or not do things, but also try to do it in a light frame of mind. He says, apply these attitudes lightly with reservation and without straining. So I like to think of it as almost like, well, if you're a kind of like a patient, in some sense, if we're trying to move from being unhappy to happy, we're trying to change how we live, we're fragile a little bit, maybe. We don't, these ideas are new and they're going to take a while to take root. And, you need to kind of move carefully, tread lightly, almost like, if you'd had an operation on your ankle, you wouldn't like go out right away and start running and lifting and bearing a lot of weight on it. You would be careful, you would be gentle, you would let it heal, right? So think of it as like we're trying to, like the Stoics are sort of like sort of doctors, and they're trying to help us heal. Although, you know, the interesting thing about mental healing in this case is you're kind of your own doctor, right? You're the patient and the doctor. So he's giving us some prescriptions, some rules, some things to sort of apply, but we're the ones that have to do it. We're the ones that have to follow those directions and make sure that we're caring for ourselves in the right sort of way. Okay, so those are our first two remarks in the handbook. Read them through, read them again and again, and try to think about them at different times of the day as you go about your life over the course of the week, and maybe reflect on them in your journal, right? Put an entry down, write about if something happens that makes you think of one of those remarks, talk about it. That'll help you to kind of get these things into your mind, get you thinking about them, help you to sort of see what it's like to see the world maybe the way a Stoic does. I mean, you might decide you don't like it, you don't want to be a Stoic, that's okay. But for this course, we're going to be practicing, we're going to be living like a Stoic, even if we don't actually decide that's what we want to be. We're going to sort of see what it's like. We're going to try it out a little bit, see what some of these tools are that Epictetus is offering us, and whether making slight changes to our habits or to what we value or what we don't value, you know, what happens? What are the consequences? Do we like the way our life maybe changes a little bit? Okay, that's it for now. I will see you guys again next week.